Hello. All right. Today we are talking about just chapter one of the textbook as far as what is communication. For this the introduction 101 course. I'm gonna do my best to work through this quickly. Yeah, we're gonna do our best to work through this quickly. There's a lot of things to cover. Um, we'll probably talk more in depth on them during our discussions on Fridays. But for now, just sort of get the general idea of what communication is, and then we'll move on from there. So the first couple questions that I usually ask any sort of freshman class that I'm in charge of are these three basic questions, and I think that you should probably pause the video here if you are in my class, just to think about these questions on your own, right? Because right now you are in the prime of your life, right? You're 18 to 22 years old. You are currently investing a lot of time and money into this academic exercise known as a university. So you want to make sure that you can answer these questions for yourself to make sure that you are doing the best you can and not wasting your time. All right, when you have very, again, you have the world open to you on anything you want to do. You want to make sure you're doing the thing that's best for you. So the first question is just why are you in college? Generally, be able to answer that very specifically. What are your long-term goals that necessitate a college degree? All right, if your long-term goals don't necessitate a college degree, start to rethink things. All right. Why are you in this class? And to say that you are in this class because it is a gen ed is an unacceptable answer. Um, you should have some sort of more specific reasons as to why you chose this class compared to a different gen ed class. All right. And let's say that you do feel like you're sort of, you have to be here because it fulfills a gen ed requirement. Final question is, okay, look, if you're going to spend 16 weeks in this class, a total of about 40 hours in the classroom, what is it that you hope to get out of this class? So there are things in our life that we have to do in order to sort of get to the next step of where we want to go. So we always want to make sure that we're getting something out of it. We don't want to sit there and say, well, things are just boring right now. I'm going to kind of grin and bear it. I'm going to get through this class the best I can. Well, if you have to be here, you might as well get something useful out of it. So, take time to reflect on these questions because the big thing for all of your life questions should be how can I move through this situation intentionally? You don't just want to fall backwards and then all of a sudden you wake up and you're 30 and you're like, how did I get here? All right, you want to make sure you're very intentional with all the steps you're taking, with the time and the money that you're investing in whatever thing that you are pursuing. All right, so let's talk about communication. So, why do we communicate? The big reason we communicate is to get ideas that are currently in our head. We're trying to get those ideas into somebody else's head. It could necessitate this idea of shared understanding, values, and belief systems. It fosters relationships. You want other people to know how you feel about the relationship, so you tell them. Hopefully, they communicate things back that are similar so you can continue on with the relationship. Whether it's a friendship, family relationship, romantic relationship, etc. With regard to gaining information, there's a theory known as uncertainty reduction theory. What that says is that we communicate to try to make things about the world less uncertain. So the world is full of many uncertain things. We have lots of questions. We might try to communicate those questions to someone in order for them to communicate back accurate answers, or we might try to be communicating information to people so that they can have a better understanding of where we're coming from. So if you and a friend have a conflict over politics, for instance, you want them to understand where you're coming from and vice versa. How does communication work? It could be verbal. It could also be nonverbal, right? But there's a lot of context involved in communication that we need to be aware of. So we're going to look at these two models up here. This first model is known as the linear model of communication. This model is known as the transactional model of communication. The linear model of communication was the first way in which scholars started to think about how does communication work. And it was very basic. You have a sender who sends a message and a receiver who receives the message. This model was accepted for a while, but then very soon scholars said this model is completely incomplete and it's too simple. Right? A lot more complicated ideas go into how communication works. So now we sort of graduated to what's known as the transactional model of communication. So there's still a sender and there's still a receiver. But one thing that we should recognize is that the sender is also receiving messages. So let's act as if I'm in the classroom, you're in the classroom, and you don't talk the whole semester. I'm talking at you as a sender with regard to information regarding the class content, and you are receiving that message. Even if you don't open your mouth all semester, you are still sending me messages. They could be nonverbal messages, and I am receiving them. So if I look at a classroom of students and their eyes are glazed over, or they're half asleep, that's sending me a message with regard to my communication strategies. And because I'm receiving those messages, I might change up the channel. I might change up the way in which I am communicating the message. So one thing that's important to realize is that the message is always the same. I have ideas about chapter 1 that I need to get to you. But based on the way in which you're responding to me, based on the context of the situation, I might change up the channel with regard to how I am sending you that message. So it could be lecture. If you're not receiving it with regard to lecture, I might say, let's do group work. I might say, let's do some Q&A. Let me put on a YouTube video. All right, I'm going to change up the channel, but the message is the same. I need to get information about chapter 1 out of my head and into your head. All this stuff out here, right, field of experience has to do with the context of the situation, right? Professor-student relationship, that dynamic is differently with regard to how you and I are going to communicate based on a friend-to-friend relationship. And there's also outside noise, right? There's also interference. So if we're in a classroom, or if you're in your house right now, right, there might be, somebody next door, right, causing noise that is distracting you. It's interrupting our clear communication strategy. Interruption could be something like, I'm hungry, right? And so I'm thinking about being hungry, right? I have, something terrible is going on in my life, and I'm thinking about that terrible event, or I'm thinking about, I have to make sure that I clean my room or mow the yard before mom gets home. And so you're thinking about these are all noise things that are inhibiting our clear communication channel. So that's what's going on in the transactional model, is all this context matters with regard to the message. It's not just, here's a message, I encode it, I send it, you decode it. A lot of other things at play here. A couple ways in which communication can happen. First is what's known as a rhetorical. So this is very intended and very strategic. So you're making an argument. You lay out an argument. You can think about, lawyers, right, in front of a court, arguing for their clients. Very intended, very strategic. Politicians use rhetorical communication. Making claims, laying out your argument. Communication could also be what's known as expressive. So these are emotional states. It could be outbursts, right? They're not necessarily, you don't plan on doing them, but once some, fact is presented to you, you might be very expressive about it, right? You have an emotional, you have an emotional situation. So this is different than something that's a bit more logical based, all right? This is very carefully planned. This is, communication that happens in the moment. That's far more expressive. All right, and then you can have what's known as accidental communication, which is unintended. Nonverbal communication falls into this a lot, right? The way in which you dress and the way you appear is sending messages about who you are, whether or not you intended that or not. So if you show up to a classroom wearing pajamas every day, you might not think consciously about how you're dressed, but that might be sending a message to your professor with regard to, okay, this person shows up late every day. That sends me a message. They're wearing pajamas. They're falling asleep. If and when this person needs help with their final grade, I might not want to take an interest in them, in helping them, because maybe they haven't, communicated a message to me that shows me that they're serious about the scholarship that they're partaking in. All right. So you want to be aware that accidental communication is always happening. You're always communicating with the world around you, whether or not it's intentional or not. Some other reasons we communicate, right? These are the goals of communication. First is to inform, just get information out there. You could communicate in order to persuade people to your viewpoint. We communicate to form and maintain relationships. So if you want to have a friendship with someone, you and that person need to have communication. And it could just be, bonding over Super Bowl was on last night, right? Just talking about the various teams. There's plenty of ways that you and your friends communicate that have nothing to do with giving them information or persuading them, but you're doing it just because you want to sort of build similar interest. Conflict management, if there is a conflict between you and another individual, you have to communicate in order to solve the conflict. They need to understand your position, you need to understand their position, and you need to understand where there's miscommunication happening. And then finally, problem solving. So this could be different than conflict, right? Because you and a team at work might need to solve, why is this month's or this quarter's profits down? we need to figure out a new strategy for, making sure that our company is continue to growing and is profitable. Verbal communication, a couple just quick little jargon words that you should know about communication. At their core, words and the sounds that come out of your mouth are abstract. They don't mean anything yet. All right. So there are things in this world, right? These tangible objects that we have. These are known as things that are signified. So here I have a pen, right? This object is described differently in various languages throughout various centuries throughout human history. People have described this thing different. They have used a different word to attach to this object. This is simply something that will be signified. It is the object. The signifier is the word. So I say the word pen, and you know that I am describing this object. There's nothing inherent about this object that means pen, except that I've used the word that you also understand as a word to mean this object as opposed to this object, right? This object is a phone, okay? So a phone is different than a pen, right? And both of these things are objects. They are those objects which are signified. The signifier is the word that we place onto those objects to describe them so that we can have shared meaning within a community of people, all right? A sign, I like to think of this as all the extra baggage that comes along with the object. So when I say pen and I point to this object, there's a lot of other things that go with that, right? So you start thinking about things like ink, black ink or blue ink. Am I writing with it? Am I taking notes with it, right? What's the relationship I have to a pen? There's different types of pens. There's ballpoint pens and fountain pens and everything else, right? Same thing with a phone. You hear the word phone and you think of a lot of other things that go along with a phone, okay? This gets a little bit more emotionally driven when we get into words like dad. So we have the word dad down here, okay? This can be, the baggage can be a little bit more emotional, right? So the object that describes dad is, biological man that has spawned children, right? That's what dad is, right? Or, maybe people saying that that's not, like, that's, a father, right? So dad and father are different signifiers that describe, biological man, spawned children, okay? The extra baggage is like, how do you think about dad, right? So if you have a good relationship, you might think like, provider, strong, breadwinner, like takes care of me, like takes me to baseball practice, whatever. If you don't have a good relationship with your dad, you have some other words to describe, right? But at the end of the day, you're taking the same signifier, the same word, attaching it to the same object to have a shared community understanding of that. But all of the extra stuff that goes along with that is known as a sign, all right? Okay. With verbal situations, we have denotative and connotative definitions. Denotative, dictionary. It's a dictionary definition, right? So yes, there are emotionally charged words, but you want to make sure that you're separating the actual definition of the word from the emotional response you might have to the word. Okay, so talked a little bit about dad. Dad, denotative definition, biological man who has spawned children. Connotative definition could be things like, provider, caretaker. It could be something more negative, right? Again, depending on the relationship that you have with the dads in your life. Okay, now here's the controversial one, all right? The denotative definition of the term illegal alien, right? And I get it. It's not, polite to say that in 2021. However, right? The denotative definition, this is why it's a good example here. This is the definition that is used in current U.S. legal policy with regard to the issue of immigration, right? So if you want to study immigration law, if you want to go through all the laws that are currently on the books for the United States government, the term you're going to come across repetitively, the only term is going to be illegal alien, right? Now there's people who want to change this, right? So it's gone from illegal alien. People are like, let's make it illegal immigrant, non-U.S. citizen, whatever. There's a whole lot of different words that people want to use to describe an individual who is currently in the United States without the proper paperwork with regard to citizenship or with regard to immigration status. So again, there's plenty of people who come into the United States who, come here for vacation, They come here to work for a while. They're on student visas, right? So they're not citizens, but they legally, but they came into the country, or yeah, they came into the country for various opportunities, right? For whatever's going on in their life. Okay. So the denotative definition of illegal alien is person or corporation, and this is why the U.S. statutes use the term alien as opposed to illegal person or illegal immigrant, because it extends to people and corporations, businesses that is operating within the United States without proper paperwork. All right, that's the denotative definition. All right, the connotative definition is all the emotional baggage that can come with that word. Right. So again, the word illegal alien, there's ways in which over the past like 5 to 10 years, people have started to say like, don't use that word. It just doesn't sound humane, or there's ways in which you could say like illegal immigrant or non-U.S. citizen, or like there's all these other words used to describe people who have come into the country illegally, who have overstayed visas, who should not currently reside in the country um, under the current legal statutes of U.S. law, right? Now you can say, well, change the law, like the whole DACA situation. If kids came here, if their parents brought them here when they're 4 years old, it's like they don't know anything else. So technically, yes, they're in the country illegally, but whether or not they should be allowed to stay or not, right? That's changing of the U.S. law, right? So the denotative definition is, again, if you study law, the words are going to come up, that's going to keep coming up in U.S. law is illegal alien. The connotative definition is like this word, it's you might feel uncomfortable with the word. It might not sound, or this phrase, it might not sound correct. You might want to change it. Again, there are people who are trying to change it so that instead of it saying illegal alien throughout U.S. laws, it's changed to something like illegal immigrant or undocumented immigrant, undocumented alien. Like there's a whole lot of phrases that people. By the end of the day, it's like denotatively, they all mean the same thing. But connotatively, some make us feel more comfortable than other phrases. All right. So know the difference between denotative, connotative definitions. Okay. A vowel is who you say you are. Ascription is who others say you are. Right. And you get into this place where you start to recognize that the way in which you describe yourself is not always the way that people see you. So there is a sort of like self-image management that goes on with regard to making sure that people are sort of seeing you the way that you want them to see you. So just know the difference between a vowel and ascription. Linguistic relativity is I think it's a fun theory. It hasn't panned out as as dramatic as the original people intended it to, but I still think it's an interesting idea. All right. So what linguistic relativity means is that the language you speak influences how you view the world. So if you speak Spanish, you might view the world a little bit differently than if you speak English, and if you speak French, and if you speak Mandarin, right? So the words in which we speak make us see the world a little bit differently. An interesting, like a very small example of this might be something like if you study the Romance languages, Spanish, French, right? All of their words are gendered, right? The las and the las and everything else, right? And so people hypothesize, or it's like, based on the way in which language is gendered, specifically in things like French and Spanish, does that change the way in which people see the world with regard to gender norms throughout the world? And some people say, yeah, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right? So this is what linguistic relativity is all about. You have this sort of small movement at the moment. There's getting some pushback right now, in like specifically in like Spanish-speaking countries, of instead of using the word Latino, right? People are using the word like Latinx or like Latinx. I don't know how people pronounce it, but it's Latin X instead of doing an O or an A, because an O designates men, an A designates women. And if you're talking about Latinos as a people group, right, are you leaving out women if you're just using Latinos, or which is the masculine form of the word? So people are saying like, we'll use like Latinx or Latinx or however you pronounce it, right? So language evolves. It's constantly changing, and the language you speak or the words you use might influence the way you see the world. One of the big questions with regard to the evolution of language is how should language evolve? Traditionally, if we go back to some of our discussions on the First Amendment Constitution, language has evolved through social interaction, right? So there's certain words that we don't use in polite society. There's certain words that we don't use, period, because they've been so stigmatized. that you're going to sound like not a good person if you use those words, right? There's so much social pressure not to use those words, and they're probably for very good reasons, right? Words that are very sexist or racist or homophobic or what have you, right? So those words used to be more common, and through various social interactions, they've become less common, right? And we can applaud those efforts. So language has evolved and changed through social interactions. The other way in which language could evolve is through force. This means things like censorship, conscription. Censorship means the government stops you from saying a word. Conscription means that the government is forcing you to say a word, like forcing you to take a pledge, right? Um, or something that's known as fascism. Now I know fascism is like a popular slogan online right now. Unfortunately, people don't have a good understanding of what fascism is. Fascism is government-supported censorship. And what this means is that, the government is putting in place various rules around language and campaigns that supports the government and tries to squash its opposition. So if the government tries to put in rules that make it so that people who disagree with it can't speak freely, that's a fascistic government. All right. It's not associated with one party or another, right? There are plenty of parties that have been more left-leaning in nature throughout history who have been fascistic because they don't want more right-leaning parties to rise up into power, and there's been plenty of right-leaning parties throughout history who have been fascistic because they don't want left-leaning powers to sort of take over. So that's what fascism is sort of the government support of squashing the ability for the opposition to oppose um, oppose policies, and this is done through various censorship efforts. All right, so that's how that's how language could evolve. All right, if you know anything about me or taking my class before, I'm a big fan of language evolving through social interaction. Right, you and I negotiating what words mean. I don't like anytime force is used with regard to language issues. All right. Okay, so that's how language could evolve. Through force, the government could censor certain words, um, right? Could force you to say certain things, right? Or through just like social interaction, where we argue, and they could be very heated and spirited arguments with regard to what your words should and should not be used. Possibly you read this book in high school, Fahrenheit 451. It's a book on this idea of how censorship and fascism could work. So just a brief overview. It came out in 1953. Fahrenheit 451 is apparently the degree needed in order to start paper on fire. So what this depicts is a dystopian future where books are burned. You have this fireman, Guy Montag. He's a fireman, but in the future, firemen start fires. They don't put out fires. So the fireman's job in this book is to go around and find people who own books, and then they take all the books and they, put them in a pile and they burn the books. Right? That's the whole purpose of a job of a fireman back in the day, or excuse me, in the future. All right. So why might people want to burn books? One is to erase the past, right? Especially if that past is unfavorable. It's like I'd like to get rid of this history. I don't want people to know that, my culture or the people that I'm associated with did things that are unfavorable. You shut down different ideas. So obviously, if one president is in power, that president might want books of the opposition to be burned or not allowed on bookstores because it goes against current policies that president wants to keep in mind. And then, sort of puritanical reasons. People want to censor things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. All right. So these are reasons why people might want to burn books. Now, in this story of Fahrenheit 451, Guy Montag is they find like this treasure trove of books. Like they go to this woman's house and she has secret rooms full of books. It's like a massive library. And they're like, oh my God, how did she get all these books? Like people are literally hiding books and she makes this giant room, right? So they take all of the books, they throw it in her living room, and they start them on fire. And she's just sitting there in her, recliner, and she just continues to read the book that she was reading. So they break into her house, they see that she's reading a book, and they're like, oh my God. They find all these other books. She just sits there and reads. They light all the books on fire, and she stays inside, and she ends up, burning with the books. On the way out, Guy Montag, he's starting to wonder. He's like, why are people willing to like be burned in a fire to keep these books? So he kind of takes one of the books with him on the way out, hides it in his jacket. he starts to read it. He's trying to figure it out. He meets this community of all these other underground, these other people who are kind of like underground, readers. He finds them, and then they, start having these conversations about books and the importance of books and ideas and not censoring and not burning books. All right, read the rest of Fahrenheit 451. All right, the end. So, with regard to Fahrenheit 451, think about, do you have examples of books where you've seen them that have been censored? And I'm going to extend this definition of censorship from the last slide. It could be censored by the government, but you think about like school boards that have censored books, or at least taken books out of curriculum. Or you can think about like private organizations or private people who have tried to censor books. So usually in the United States, we don't see the government censoring books. And there are ways in which people try to exaggerate, I think, a little bit with regard to, a school has banned a book. Usually school districts, they don't ban books. What they do is they say, we're going to take this book out of the curriculum. It'll still be available in the library, but they'll say like, we're not going to read Huck Finn anymore, or To Kill a Mockingbird, or Beloved. Like, we're not going to read those books on the syllabus anymore. They're still available at the library, but people have sort of taken this like, oh my gosh, they're censoring books. But there are some robust discussions as to, what books should and should not be taught. And there are robust discussions with regard to what books should and should not be available in certain libraries. Libraries, public libraries, either at a school or in a community, have limited shelf space. And there have been, every few months, there are examples around the United States where a group of people will come into the library and say, like, this book should be removed from the shelf because this book is a bad book. It perpetuates an idea that we don't like. And it's been everything from, well, the only two examples I can think of right now are like religious examples. So various Christian organizations try to get like Harry Potter removed from libraries. And a couple years ago, there was a Muslim organization down in Texas that successfully got this graphic novel removed from a library that depicted this like Al Qaeda member as a terrorist, and then there's like a superhero in this graphic novel who stopped the terrorist. So there are examples where, people are getting material removed from libraries. It doesn't mean that that they're not available for you to purchase on Amazon. Although there are plenty of campaigns where people try to get Amazon to remove books from their collection. So look for some of those examples, maybe research a little bit. All right. This right here is a depiction of Nazis having a book burning party. They were very fond of this. Obviously, you don't want ideas that go against, Hitler's ideas. And then I love this picture right here of a pencil that says, "This machine kills fascists," which, is just this sort of play on being able to write and express your ideas freely. Like that's the way that you sort of campaign against people who want to silence you, right? Again, fascism is a political stance, but sometimes it's used as this idea of like, if private citizens are trying to censor each other, technically they're not fascist, they are acting fascistically, right? Now, if a private citizen tries to go to the government and say, "Government, help me censor Josh," then you could say, okay, now you're being a fascist because you're trying to get the government involved, which is where fascism lies, right? Government-supported censorship. But people can be fascistic, which means they are trying to get, other people to not speak in opposition to them. But if you freely write and if you read lots of books, that or here's a good one. Like if you read the books that people don't want you to read, that's a way in which you can fight fascism. So I have this very nasty habit of anytime anyone tells me that there's a book that is controversial and I shouldn't read it, or anytime I sort of find a news story where a group of people have tried to get a book removed from a public library or Amazon or whatever, I go out immediately and buy that book. And I've probably done this about 20 to 30 times over my life. Some of the books I've gotten, like they are pretty terrible, and I'm like, I don't like this, but I'm a thinking adult. I'll figure it out on my own. Some of the books I read, and I'm like, I think this book is great. Some of the books I'm kind of indifferent about. I'm like, I don't really know why this was a problem. But that's one way in which, I always try to just make sure that I am being open-minded, and that I, again, even if it's a book I never would have picked up, I try to support a more robust, open, society of readers and writers, as opposed to allowing, a small group of people to tell me what I can and can't read, because I'm an adult and I'll figure out what I want to read on my own. All right. Um, People should be persuading one another through communication, not through sanctions or violence. So if there's an idea you don't like, you should argue with the person and use your words. You shouldn't go through sanctions. You shouldn't go to the government. You shouldn't go to a bookstore and say, bookstore, like, get rid of this person's book, or we're gonna like be violent on your bookstore. It's like, you should persuade. If you don't like a book that someone wrote, like, you should write a follow-up book. You should write a book that says, like, hey, I read this other guy's book and his book is garbage, and I'm going to tell you why it's garbage. Right? That's how academic, intelligent debate should happen. It shouldn't be like, this guy wrote a book I don't like, get rid of it. It should be, this guy wrote a book I don't like, I'm going to write a book that tells everybody why he was wrong. Right? That's how it should work. All right. Tangentially with chapter 1, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of communicating with the gods. So people have communicated lots of ways, and one way that is, I think, grossly under-researched in communication studies is the ways in which people try to communicate with the gods. So you think, okay, why do people want to communicate with the gods? They've been trying to get knowledge for centuries. Uncertainty reduction theory. The world is a very uncertain place. I want answers, so I'm going to try to ask, God or the gods, of my religion, what those answers are. And again, this still goes on today. Okay, so there are ways in which people try to communicate, that I don't think we are reflective enough on, and I don't think we recognize it in ourselves as much, with regard to communication strategy. So how have people try to communicate with the gods? People take up things like prayer, obviously. People engage in lots of drugs. They read holy books. They play games of chance, right? So they toss what are called lots. So this is a Santeria exercise up here, where they're taking these shells and they cast them down. And based on which ones are up and which ones are down, it's telling you yes or no with regard to questions that you're asking. Or tarot cards, right? Shuffle a deck, and then the way that they sort of come out, someone who knows how to read tarot cards is sort of telling you what your future is and what ways in which you should sort of go about your life. All right. So lots of ways in which people have tried to communicate with the gods, and still try to communicate with the gods. We do it verbally and non-verbally. So this is the Hajj right here on the far left. So people who are of Muslim faith, once in their lifetime, they're supposed to go to Mecca and go on what's known as the Hajj, which is this sort of like this walking pilgrimage. And this is a way in which they show devotion to God and sort of and communicate with Allah, right? People communicate with gods with regard to dress codes. So, various faiths have different ways in which you're supposed to style your clothing, or your appearance. For men, there's different religions have different views on how you're supposed to wear your hair and your beard, right? Like, these are things that people follow in order to sort of let God know, I'm listening to you. I'm trying to communicate and align my personal appearance with whatever will God is trying to bestow upon you. Different ideas on like modesty, etc., happen with dress codes. All right. And then over there we have like evangelicals, in the Christian faith, depending on if it's Pentecostal or what have you. Things like snake handling, walking on coals, refusing medicine. These are things that people do to sort of show their faith to the God in which they believe. All right. So these are different ways people are trying to communicate with God. There you have it. Some older ways people have tried to communicate. First, you have what are known as the Nazca lines of Peru, which I think are super cool. All right. You're gonna see this stuff on like ancient alien nonsense on like History Channel a lot. It's not what it's for. All right. Has nothing to do with aliens. Okay. But there are people who try to communicate with gods by sort of making these large, elaborate drawings on the earth. Now, this is before airplanes, all right? So this is why it becomes of interest, and people are like, maybe they're trying to talk to aliens. Okay, they're on the ground, and they could be seen as some sort of like labyrinth, right? So if you are a part of a tribe where animals and the spirits of animals are important, or you're trying to communicate something to God through a depiction of an animal, You might draw a big giant animal on the ground, right? So imagine this, right? So we have some sort of, it looks like some sort of insect, okay? Um, this is a few football fields long, all right? So if this big giant bug on the ground is a few footballs long, it's like, okay, God up in the sky can see this. The people of your tribe are trying to send God a message with regard to, what it is that is important to you, sacrifices you might be making to God, etc. All right. So here's one ways in which people have tried to communicate. These big giant carvings in the ground, these are known as geoglyphs. All right. So that's one way in which people have tried to communicate with God back in the day. You also have this story of Moses and the burning bush. So yeah. All right. So most of you probably know the story. Moses goes to a mountaintop. God takes the form of a burning bush. And then, Moses comes down from the mountaintop with the Ten Commandments. All right. So whether or not the burning bush is literal or figurative, what Moses, what state of mind Moses was in when he sort of had this like revelation, there should be a recognition that throughout history, people have sort of sat in quiet contemplation and have had visions or have heard voices, or maybe not like out loud voices, but people have sort of, yeah, they've had a vision, or they have um, feel as if they've been given direction, right? Someone has like planted an idea inside of their head, right? And they have some sort of spiritual experience based on something that is just very sort of like in this contemplative state. So this is one way in which people have felt that God has spoken to them. They go out in the world. They're very open and receptive. They're very quiet, and then they just sort of have this feeling of making this decision or going in a certain direction, and then they believe that that was God speaking to them, and then they sort of act in accordance with that. Here we have this guy named Ptolemy. Ptolemy is an extremely important individual who also had some, ideas that we now see as a bit not so good. But he's extremely important to astronomers. He created, astronomy. He created a lot of models for the universe. He mapped out the stars, etc., like cartography kind of stuff, right? He had these star catalogs, right? But, like many other individuals, 2,000 years ago, he was also trying to read the stars and figure out if the movements of the stars were communicating some ideas from God. Similar things were going on with Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, obviously, we know him, right? Newtonian laws, physics, a lot of important mathematical equations. Isaac Newton was also he was also really into alchemy, right? He was also really into like reading the Bible and looking for numerology and figuring out, if the Bible had these secret decoding messages he could look for, right? So Ptolemy is this guy who mapped out the stars with regard to astronomy, but he was also writing about astrology. So this idea of like the stars are telling us messages from God. Like if I follow certain stars, I can, have a fruitful life. So astrology and horoscopes, they're nonsense, all right? But even our most robust, important scientists throughout the millennia, various scientists had these sort of deep relationships with trying to communicate with the gods in ways that we now see as not accurate. All right, we'll put it that way. Okay. Just quick Romans here. All right. Romans were also trying to communicate with the gods as far as like planning their life. So, fun little story of this is we have Venus and we have Mars, these two Roman gods. So, Venus, the woman, Mars is the man. Venus is the goddess of love, Mars is the god of war. The Romans believed that when you sort of looked up in the sky and these two were aligned in the sky, Venus and Mars were aligned in the sky as the planets, they're like, oh, the god and goddess are aligned. This is a really good time for sex, sexuality, finding a partner, getting married. They thought that this sort of alignment of the stars of Venus and Mars was communicating things to young people with regard to when's a good time to get married, have sex, all this other kind of stuff. All right. So there are ways in which, the Romans were also trying to read the planets, because their gods, they use their gods to name the planets, and all of a sudden they want answers for how to work, how to adjust their lives. And finally, here, all right, with regard to seeking out wisdom from the gods, the reason why people communicate with the gods, I call this the age of revelation. Like, things are being revealed to you, as opposed to the age of enlightenment, which is, you're using scientific reason. Um, the thing is that, we didn't really know a lot about the natural world or the scientific method. So people were trying to get answers, right? So don't sit there and like malign people from the past who are doing the best they could with the resources they had to try to get the best answers they could. Like, we're trying to get the best answers we can in 2021 with the methods that we have available to us. They were trying to get the best answers they could with the methods available to them, and the best that they could come up with were a lot of, um, you know revelatory ways with regard to, talking and trying to communicate with God with regard to how to structure their life. All right. The more we communicated, the more we were refining our senses of reason. So we were looking to God. We were trying to figure things out. Um, in the late 14, early 1500s, the printing press evolves, publications and literacy starts to take off in the aftermath of the Black Plague. So we start moving into an age of enlightenment where people are more willing to embrace the scientific method, as opposed to just looking for answers through revelatory means, as far as communication with God and religious text. All right. So this is one way we communicate. We do communicate with the gods. There are ways in which people still communicate with God, or try to communicate with the God of their faith, through prayer and the rest of it. But at the end of the day, the age of enlightenment, people who are deeply committed to science are trying to figure out answers to questions that they cannot figure out. People are deeply committed to faith, right? And there's people in both camps, right? There's plenty of crossover. There's people who are scientific who go to church, and there's plenty of people at church who are scientifically minded. Um, but people who are praying and looking for, direction from God are also uncertain about what they should do. And so they're looking for answers with regard to how to sort of carry on the next step in order to, yeah, have a fruitful life for themselves. All right. So this is what's going on in communication. A lot of it's based on what's known as uncertainty reduction theory. We are trying to reduce the amount of uncertainty that's in our lives. And there's various ways that we've gone about it. One of the ways is through things like, prayer, and the rest of the ways in which, we have communicated with the gods of the past. Okay, that's what I have for today. We will pick this up next time.